All right, cool. Cool. So we're recording no swearing on the call. That's mostly for me, not for the rest of y'all. But I'd love to introduce you to this little dream team over here. So I'm Lindsay. I lead the America's Enablement team at Stripe. Been with Stripe for about a year. Nikki, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Nikki Lusk. I'm Nicole Lusk. If you look me up on LinkedIn, I'm still Nicole. It's my legal name, but most people who I call friends call me Nikki. So as my mom says, you can call me anything except for late for dinner. But I work at Oracle NetSuite. I've been here for about the past year or so. I'm a principal sales enablement advisor at NetSuite, which is just a fancy way of saying that I directly support a couple of our sales verticals, although I work with the larger enablement team on bigger enablement programs. I live in Denver, Colorado. For anybody that's in Denver, Deborah, I see you. Yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Nikki. Appreciate it. So what does our breakdown look like today? Let's go over the agenda. So again, we'll do a quick intro, quick icebreaker today, which is awesome. We're going to give you a little bit of overview and some hot takes on what we think around MEDDPICC and methodology. We're going to share a few examples. So I have an example. Nikki has a couple of examples. We'll be sharing out what those rollouts have looked like for us. We'll share some of the TLDR best practices and lessons learned from those rollouts. We've done a lot of stuff. We kind of summed it up into a few bullet points for you. And then we'll be doing some Q&A time or some breakout time. And then we'll end from there. So that'll be our 60 minutes in total. Cool? Awesome. First things first, there's a raise hand. For those of you that aren't as familiar with Zoom or don't typically use it, there is a little reaction bar that shows up on the bottom bar of your screen in Zoom. If you hit that, there's a raise hand function. I'd love for anybody that's ever rolled out MEDDPICC, MEDDPICC, or any other variation of it in the past, go ahead and use that raise hand function. We got one, we got two. Anyone else? All right, cool. That's totally okay. It's a net new thing. It's definitely a net new phenomenon. We're really excited to dive in with you and share a little bit more around MEDDPICC specifically. So if we wander over to the next slide, we want to share a hot take with you all. So when we talk about qualification work and we talk framework and we talk about methodology, we hear those words used interchangeably quite a bit, right? As we think about how we help our sellers sell, what are those success things that look like? And here's the hot take, y'all. With a methodology is really the art and qualification is really the science. So as we think about qualification frameworks and methodology, they go hand in hand because we know that the art and science are what makes something very, very beautiful and very, very functional, right? And that's really what we want to see here when we look at these types of methodologies alongside MEDDPICC. So you can think about a methodology as that way that you do those selling skills or those seller acumen skills. So you're thinking about your messaging, the value of your service, the value of your product, why you, why now, and why your product, right? It's the ability to be able to multi-thread with multiple stakeholders. So how do you have those different conversations at those different levels? It's also about those levels of listening during discovery. So really those general sales skills and those actions that folks need to take that they can customize based on their deal, based on who they're talking to, and based on what else is going on throughout the sales cycle, right? So a little bit more of that art, a little bit more fluid, a little less kind of black and white sort of, right? The difference then is when we go to qualification framework, you're really thinking about metrics. What is a qualified deal? What is a disqualified deal? One that may not be eligible. Validation of important stakeholders. So who are all of your stakeholders, but who's the most important? Confirmation of necessary deal information. So what are those business requirements that the customer has? What are those technical requirements the customer has? And how does that play into your product? And then really thinking about that kind of streamlined information gathering process, that's really that qualification framework overall. So when we talk about that in the context of MEDDPICC, it's important to understand that MEDDPICC is really leaning more heavily towards that science component and really giving you those quick and dirty parameters for exactly how and what information you need in a streamlined format to make sure that you are mitigating risk in your deal, that you are identifying whether or not this deal is appropriately qualified and making sure that your sellers are spending the appropriate amount of time on that deal itself. But that is very different from methodology because that's more of that art, that relationship building, right? So I wanted to give you a little bit of that context because we do have that hot take, but we hear a lot of times folks calling MEDDPICC a methodology. Realistically, it's actually a qualification framework. So next slide on here, we've got a whole big rundown of what MEDDPICC actually is. So starting at the top, we've got metrics. So it's the quantifiable measures of value that your solution can provide. So things like, how would you measure the solution? What does that mean? What are the things that are most important or most top of mind for your customer? Then there's the economic buyer. So that's the person that has the money, and that's the person that gets to decide whether or not that money is going to be spent on your product, right? So they're the ones that actually can say yes or no and sign off on it. We also then have decision criteria. So what are the things that the customer needs? What are that set of criteria, those sets of requirements that they have to make the decision to move forward with your product or not move forward with your product, right? And then there's the process. What does that look like, right? What are those step-by-step things that the buyer has to do? Who are those people they have to go to? Who's the business unit they have to go to? All of that fun stuff lives within that decision process. So you'll document it there. And then moving on to the next one. So implicate pain, identify pain, all of those fun things. Essentially, what's the business case? What is the reason that they're looking? What is the problem they're trying to solve? What is the thing that's hurting them? What is the thing that's mitigating them from achieving their goals? And then what is it that potentially you could help with your own solution, right? Then there's champion. So that's a person that has that power and influence and credibility within the organization. So not just with the economic buyer, hopefully they do, but also thinking about those other business units that you need them to go to, or those other people that you need them to go to. That's that person that's in the room, in the organization, that's able to make that happen. Excuse me. And then last but not least, there's competition. That's pretty straightforward. I think in sales enablement, we deal with a ton of competition all the time. That threat exists everywhere. I'm sure you've got a whole bunch of high spot pages or other CMS pages, but this is just identifying what competition exists out there that your customer might be validating, looking at, comparing, contrasting, or maybe they're trying to move away from and do a rip and replace. So that's kind of TLDR of the MEDDPICC overview and the really common ways that we think about MEDDPICC. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki, and Nikki's going to walk you through the first rollout that she's gone through of MEDDPICC. Nikki, over to you.
Awesome. So we wanted to start with a MEDDPICC overview, but just so we're all kind of on a level playing field, we've already asked and found out that we have differing levels of MEDDPICC expertise in the group. But it is important to understand that there are different variations of MEDDPICC. So that's relevant to this first one. We actually use the MEDDPICC acronym, which is all of the same letters that we just covered in the last slide, but we added a P for paper process. And part of that is because to Lindsay's earlier point about the difference between a methodology versus a qualification framework, we were rolling out the MEDDPICC framework as part of a larger sales methodology rollout. So that's important to note, is that obviously there are differences in how you're approaching the rollout, depending on if you're doing it hand in hand with the methodology rollout versus if you're just doing a MEDDPICC or MEDDPICC or MEDDPICC, as Lindsay's company has two I's, implementation. So my first story about MEDDPICC rollout is at my last company. It was in early stage SaaS startup, so I don't mind saying the name, but it was called GTM Hub at the time. They're renamed to Quantive. It was an OKR platform. So really early stage, probably most of you have heard of OKRs, but it's pretty new concept and kind of like a hot software category, if you will. So when I worked there, I started at the company when there was maybe only like 50 employees. And by the time I left, there was 250 employees, give or take. So it was a very early startup. We had just closed our Series B. I think they were already on Series C now. So just to give you an idea of where they were in their journey. It was rolled out as part of a methodology rollout inspired by Force Management's Command of the Message. So I'm sure that is a familiar term to a lot of you. This was kind of a unique rollout in that, one, I was an enablement function of one. So I was the only enablement person in the entire company. And two, this was mandated by sales leadership, new sales leadership that had come in. So we had an SVP of sales, and then we hired a new CRO. They had both used Force Management, Command of the Message, and by extension MEDDPICC in former roles, and that was just already how they actually operated as sales leadership. So the concept here, or the ask, was to create our own content based on that framework. However, because of the size of the company, because of the stage of the company, and because of the level of experience, both in our sales leadership team and specifically in the candidates that they were looking to, scale up with the sales team, they were looking for people who had Command and Message and MEDDPICC experience. So we didn't want to go through the full Force Management, Command and Message rollout, which, as you all know, is a very robust process. So they asked me to build all of our own content. So that was kind of the background on it. Some important factors to note is that I had really strong sales leadership buy-in. So that is kind of the ideal state, is if your entire sales leadership and most of your senior reps are, already methodology champions and MEDDPICC champions. That's definitely the ideal state. That's not always the case, as you'll hear about in my second example. But we had a really experienced sales team who was able to support each other. I learned a ton about the MEDDPICC methodology and, the Command and Message framework from working with that team that I was able to take into future roles and rollouts, which I'm utilizing a lot now at a new company, rolling it out where I don't have that level of experience. We work really closely with the sales operations team, so we were able to have full CRM integration immediately, which again was an ideal state. But one thing that really made it also unique was that because I had that buy-in from the sales leadership team, I was able to build an enablement rollout or an enablement roadmap that was completely centered around MEDDPICC and MEDDPICC terms and methodology and all of the concepts in there, which again was kind of perfect in a perfect world. If we all could be so lucky all of the time, I totally recognize that is not the case most of the time. So what did our rollout actually look like? First, we started with why did this go out of order? Weird, sorry. Okay, oh, I know. Okay, so we did a large scale rollout, which I'm not going to focus on that so much here because that's not what's unique. We did the, overview training, we did the manager training, we did the rep training, we did all of that fun stuff. But where this one was really unique is in the monthly reinforcement. So the way that I built that roadmap was a monthly MEDDPICC element focus. So after we did the primary rollout, we trained everybody, what did the terms mean? Then we started digging in. So month one was around economic buyer and champion. During week one, we did an asynchronous e-learning to get into some concepts of economic buyer and champion. What are the questions you ask? What are the different personality types you face? How do you test your champion? All of those kind of things. Week two, we did a live workshop where we were able to do some role play scenarios and just kind of review the information that was presented in the e-learning. Then week three, we did a MEDDPICC deal review where the whole team got on a call and dug in together on one deal that was open in the pipeline at the time. And then week four, we did one-on-one MEDDPICC deal reviews. So to follow up, I would meet with reps one-on-one. We'd go through each of their opportunities or just an opportunity per rep and do a MEDDPICC deal review. So that was really the unique thing about that launch. Was the launch was pretty basic, but then the follow-up was really, really great because we were able to really focus 100% on MEDDPICC. Okay, so that's the first story. I'll pass it back to Lindsay to share her experience.
Sure, thank you. So there's a couple of deltas that come across throughout all of your rollouts, and that's okay, y'all. When we think about MEDDPICC, it's really tailored to thinking about the general tenure of your company, the general tenure of your AEs, your reps, your leaders that are in the company, where else they've worked at, and what exposure they've had to MEDDPICC. So in this instance, this is actually for Stripe for my current company. We are still actually in process of the reinforcement stage of this, which is quite funny. So we'll talk more about that in a second. But Stripe overall, 7,000 person company, so about a couple thousand to 2,500 sellers worldwide that we're thinking about. So that includes your AEs and your SDRs and your sales leaders, frontline sales leaders in that number. We do also have about 300 SDRs, and we've got about 1,000 SAs. Solution architects, you can also think of them as your solution engineers, your solution consultants. So that's important here for a number of reasons. But again, we are a late stage, well-established company. We've been around for a while. I'm sure you've heard of us, or if you haven't, you probably have used our product and you just don't know it yet, and that's totally fine. We did actually roll out MEDDPICC standalone with a methodology rollout about a year prior. That's important in this conversation, and I'll tell you why in just a second. We did have mixed sales leadership buy-in at the onset, and we did have to overcome that before we could really fully roll this out, which is part of the reason why this integration has taken a little longer and why we're still kind of in the reinforcement stage, even though realistically we started this work about middle to late Q3 of last year. We do have partial integration with CRM. I'll explain what partial integration means momentarily. And then we, again, still have reinforcement ongoing, at least for H1. So a couple of factors in play that are happening here at Stripe. One, I mentioned that we rolled this out standalone with a methodology rollout about a year prior. So that happened towards the end of 2021. We rolled out what is called S3, which is Stripe Strategic Selling, is what that stands for. And you could think of it more as a grab bag of those different arts that I was referring to. So it's things like the 3 C's of objection handling, or the 4 levels of listening, or things like that, right? So it didn't necessarily have a cohesive, this is when you use it at what point in the deal cycle. It's more of, hey, practice these general sales skills and sales competencies that you should know. With that, it was not well received, transparently. From my understanding, that was prior to my time, but it sounds like there is still sentiment today that's a fairly detracting sentiment because there isn't tangible, how do you use the thing and when do you use the thing within our methodology. So we did roll out MEDDPICC standalone kind of almost in response to that, but that's also part of why we saw mixed sales leadership buy-in. There's a brand component that goes into that. There are some detractors that we have in sales leaders that we needed to get bought in to even putting out something as large as MEDDPICC. And that was part of what we were trying to achieve both at the beginning before we even rolled this out and even during some of our pilots and our coaching workshops. And one of the things you heard Nikki allude to is that we have a second I, and that is implementation. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, that is actually one of the biggest ways that we were able to get enough leadership buy-in to move forward from the key stakeholders that we needed. And why is that? We had one detractor in particular here in the Americas who was very firm on the fact that MEDDPICC only really is helpful through deal signed. But for Stripe, even when we sell somebody our products, we don't actually make money after that point in time until a customer is actually using and processing volume on us. That's how we make money. We are fully consumption based. So we felt like we were perpetuating this idea that you were done with your account as soon as you hit deal signed. And so one of the things that we said is, okay, in your ideal state, what would you want to see in MEDDPICC? What would you want to see that would help with that breakage? And she said, implementation. I need people to understand the technical and business requirements to actually get whatever product they're trying to sell actually activated and processing. And that was a big deal for us, but that meant that we put in this custom flavor of MEDDPICC that doesn't exist. But to be honest, it's worked out really well, and it's one of the most successful areas, and we have seen about a 12% increase in activations since the initial rollout. And we do believe it's attributed to this implementation component as well. So that's kind of cool. Just putting that out there. But that's one of the ways that we did that mixed sales leadership buy-in and kind of what we saw to help overcome that. The other thing that I wanted to call out before we go into what exactly we did is that partial integration for CRM. Because we're a bigger organization, it is a lot harder to get something changed in Salesforce because there's so many different pages where it would need to be changed if we were to change it in one spot. We do run on SFDC, so therefore it was a lot harder to be able to actually get what we needed done in CRM. So while we don't have specific tracks for each of the different components of MEDDPICC, the different parts of the acronym, we do have a notes field that exists in all parts of our opportunity that already pre-fill each of the acronyms and then have a couple of sample questions as well. Folks are expected to fill that out. So that's what I mean by partial integration. That's not perfect, but it was something that we were able to do, and we were able to negotiate with sales operations to make happen, which is cool. So what did we do and what are we doing? First, we started with an all hands announcement. So We did that to generate excitement. We do have a pretty mature and tenured sales organization. So when we polled a lot of our AEs, most of them have used some variation of MEDDPICC in the past. So being able to announce it in a big format like that and hear from 3 different leaders saying why they're excited about MEDDPICC and why they're excited about MEDDPICC at Stripe was really important to us. So that's kind of where we started with that all hands announcement. We then did a coaching workshop. So helping managers first understand what is MEDDPICC. So that way we made sure we were all on the same baseline, but also how do you coach to it and when are the great opportunities to coach? What are those times where you want to do it when they're doing territory planning versus when they're coming towards the end and they're in the negotiation phase of an opportunity, right? So did a whole bunch of different scenarios within our manager coaching workshop for different parts of the sales cycle. We then launched microlearning and an asset homepage. So we have HighSpot. We also have Enablement for our LMS. So we launched a series of microlearning videos focusing on 2 to 3 minutes for each acronym. What are the things that you need to know? What are the things that you should gather at the beginning? And what are the things that you should continue to validate as you move through the cycle? We then did global live workshops. So we had a 90-minute workshop. That's actually the basis of how this became a thing, is because I sent over our workshop to Matt. So that's kind of how this came to be. We did a high-level overview of, hey, here's what you need to do for MEDDPICC. Where have you used it in the past? And then we built out scenarios that were based on our segments so that our segments could practice MEDDPICC on their own. We then did, for the rest of the year, key opportunity review coaching. So that looked like a couple of different things. One, we leveraged a couple of our experienced champion sales leaders who were really good at MEDDPICC and had used it in the past and were especially stoked about it to go into other teams and help them do key opportunity review coaching with that manager, so that manager could get used to what that coaching would sound like. They had a model and an example to share with. We, as Enablement, also went in and helped support key opportunities reviews as well during team meetings and provided a little bit of coaching to AEs as well as sales leaders during that time. So we continued to do that through all key opportunity reviews, especially as we came towards the end of the year and really needed to close out a lot of our deals. It was also especially helpful because a lot of our opportunities were in flight when we went through a round of layoffs. And so we were able to leverage this review coaching to help people get to know those opportunities very quickly that they had to take over for a peer that may no longer be at Stripe. With that, we're still in process of doing continued reinforcement via team meetings. So that looks like a couple of different things. For me personally, that means meeting with each of my frontline managers for my segments to understand where they feel like their team is on MEDDPICC and what they both need help with, and building out quick team meeting activities for them to be able to implement in their team meetings. At a broader level, we're looking at that at a segment specific, excuse me, losing my train of thought here. We're doing that at the segment specific level as well to build out more scenarios that people can practice during larger segment team meetings, because the way that MEDDPICC is implemented looks very different for SMB versus our enterprise folks. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it back over to Nikki. She's going to walk us through the last rollout.
All right, so last rollout example. And by the way, Tammy, thank you so much for having your camera on, because you keep smiling and nodding, and I'm like, okay, we're on the track, we're on the right track. So thank you for your encouragement. Okay, so last rollout example could not be more different from my first rollout example. Probably some of the similar challenges that Lindsay has faced, but I would go so far as to say a lot more, and that is related to the scale of the rollout. So I currently work at Oracle NetSuite, and we are in the midst of a MEDDPICC rollout now, which doesn't impact the Oracle org at all. NetSuite operates as an independent business unit within Oracle, but NetSuite by itself is close to 20,000 employees, and the sales org is over 1,000 sales reps just on the direct side, not counting our account management org. So it's very, very, very big, very segmented, verticalized, geographically specific. We have a global organization as well. So the scope of the MEDDPICC rollout has started small and picked up traction. It kind of started as a localized initiative on our account management org that was driven specifically by our AVP of the account management org, who just kind of heard about it and was like, we need to tighten up our qualification process. Let's roll out MEDDPICC for AMO. And that we had such great success with it that now the rest of the org is kind of picking up. So we're in the midst of the direct sales rollout. We've done the launch. We're in the reinforcement phase. We are also launching to JPAC teams, EMEA teams. We're now including sales support teams. So it's just, like I said, snowballed. So way different learnings and things from the current launch of MEDDPICC. We are rolling it out. So similar to Lindsay's experience at Stripe, we have a homegrown sales methodology that we follow called Sweet Success, which has been a challenge definitely in terms of MEDDPICC, and also to Lindsay's point, one of the reasons why we need MEDDPICC. I find this as someone who is very focused on sales methodologies, sales psychology, very scalable selling processes, coming into a mature sales organization like NetSuite, who has been built based on their own experiences without a whole lot of external influence, has been really interesting. MEDDPICC is really one of the first large scale rollouts that we're doing that incorporates influence outside of lessons learned from just NetSuite experience. So that's been pretty crazy. Because of that, again, we've definitely experienced some challenges. So I'll explain what our rollout process has looked like, both on the AMO side and the launch, and then I'll tie it into the challenges. So as I mentioned on our account management org, it came from a leadership initiative down. Our AVP said, I want to do MEDDPICC, enablement, get your MEDDPICC materials ready to go. Everybody else get on board with MEDDPICC. And he just started using MEDDPICC terminology immediately. So people kind of had to just get with it. And that was hugely beneficial for the account management side of things. We definitely still saw some resistance and some, hesitation from a change management perspective from account managers. It was challenging, but they didn't have a choice because their manager was asking them questions related to MEDDPICC, asking them where their MEDDPICC information or details or summaries were. So that was super duper helpful. What we did for that launch for account management was we launched it at sales kickoff last year. Everybody was trained in a webinar style. We presented a internal term, e-learning term, so that everyone could get an overview. Then we did workshops for both managers and reps. And then we focused on follow-up. With the direct sales, we've had a little bit of a even more challenge. Again, most of my direct sales managers, including all the way up to I don't even know his title, but the leader of the entire sales organization at NetSuite, it's like, what's MEDDPICC? So that's been very interesting. Yeah, exactly. I see some smiles. So it's been a lot more of change management, a lot more of trying to teach them that you have to adopt MEDDPICC, you have to drive, that accountability with your teams if you want to see the success that the account management org has seen. So for the direct sales, we've done it in a phased rollout where we've done region by region because they asked for a very quick turnaround time. So we delivered an asynchronous e-learning overview. We did a manager workshop, we did a rep workshop, and then we have followed up. So key pieces to this change management process is visibility and reminders with the managers. So I am jumping into manager meetings all the time, always talking about MEDDPICC. I am it is central concept that we are discussing, our central topic in every single monthly executive sync that we have. Honestly, to the point of just harassing the managers about getting MEDDPICC deal reviews on schedule, nominating reps to do one-on-one MEDDPICC deal reviews with me. And it is very exciting because it's starting to catch on. You're starting to hear MEDDPICC terms in all hands meetings and sales 411s. And definitely more managers are becoming bought into the methodology just through practice. So let me make sure I got everything. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's everything in terms of that one, but we'll go to a question and answer in a little bit so you all can ask more specifically. But again, could not be more different than my first experience when it comes to MEDDPICC rollout, and still learning. All right, so I'll pass back to you, Lindsay, to highlight best practices.
Cool, thank you. So folks, I mentioned this at the beginning of the call, but Nikki and I do have frequent one-on-ones together where we talk about all things, which is how we kind of came together to talk through MEDDPICC, because what's really cool is as we were starting our rollout, I was able to tap into Nikki to ask some great questions from some of her best practices and lessons learned. And what's funny is even though all three of these rollouts that we just mentioned are very, very different, there are a lot of themes that we would strongly recommend as best practices or things that we learned the hard way. So I want to kind of go over those with y'all. First best practice, get your sales leader buy-in and make sure you have multiple sales leaders, not just thinking about your direct stakeholders, but maybe also your cross-functional partners. One thing that was really helpful is that when we talk about our sales leadership here at Stripe, we are always talking about our SDRs and our SAs as well. That's just the way that we include it. So that leadership team is part of every sales meeting and that kind of overall go-to-market meeting. So having their buy-in as well was super critical. And we were able to successfully roll out MEDDPICC as a result, even with our SAs who historically need a very different set of criteria and different set of enablement than we do on the sales side. But they work really closely with AEs, especially during the technical discovery portion of what we do here at Stripe to think about connectors and integration and things like that. And so they were able to then position some of the MEDDPICC questions that we needed to get during that time on behalf of the AEs, which was really cool. And that all was because we had sales leader buy-in at that cross-functional level and not just a couple of our segments, right? So really emphasize that. The next thing is just emphasizing and focusing on the deal review portion. It's really great that we can talk in theory about what those metrics are and what the questions are that you can ask your user or ask your customer for metrics, right? What are those things you need to gather? But it's never going to be relevant and real to your AEs until you actually are going through a deal review process. Otherwise, a lot of it is just theoretical. And you can have them bring an opportunity to your workshop, but giving them that continued reinforcement through their deal review helps them pattern match and ultimately understand what's going to be successful. And what are those questions that for you, your industry, your product, your solution really resonates or doesn't resonate with your customers and your ideal customer profile. Next thing, update your sales assets to include MEDDPICC. We'll talk a bit about this too in a sample rollout that Nikki will share, but really think about as many of your sales assets as possible and how you can position them to include MEDDPICC. So looking at existing content to say, how can we reposition this in a MEDDPICC format? What are those ways that we could think about specific MEDDPICC sales assets that folks can quickly grab down and leverage? How can we build out an example email template so that they can pull it down and leverage it for their customer? All of those different things, but updating those assets overall. And then last but not least, just ensure MEDDPICC field and or tracking is added to the CRM in some capacity. Strong preference towards doing it in a fully integrated way. Just make sure you're thinking about the limitations of your size and the scope and the complexity of your instance of your CRM, whatever it is that you use. The other thing, some of our lessons learned, some of the things that we learned the tough way. As much as you can, try to launch either net new or integrate with an existing methodology. Doing it step by step without really fully integrating can make it a little confusing to understand how all of those things play together. That's also true for things like account plans and territory plans too. Think about how you can integrate as much as possible, and that bleeds a little bit into this updating of sales assets, but also leads into the broader, more comprehensive, what is a sales methodology at your company, right? Gain alignment from all cross-functional partners. So talked about that quite a bit, talking about that sales leader buy-in, but getting that alignment from cross-functional partners. That also can look like things as simple as getting with your PMMs to help them understand that this qualification framework will exist. And is there an opportunity for them to update their pitch decks or their first call decks or any other assets that they're building for the sellers to include sample MEDDPICC questions or a reminder to leverage MEDDPICC or what qualified and not qualified would look like for how they could solve for it using MEDDPICC, right? Number of different ways, but you want to leverage all of those cross-functional partners to make sure that it's fully integrated into the entire ecosystem of what your seller is going to do on a day-to-day basis. Next thing, leverage your champions as a pilot. We mentioned this before. MEDDPICC is something that's pretty standard across the board. It's external. So you're going to have a champion at your company that has used MEDDPICC in the past. It may not be at your org, but it's definitely going to be somewhere else. We leveraged a champion. He was absolutely wonderful. And because of him, we saw a ton of success, but he did a lot of great work for us because he was so vocal about the importance of MEDDPICC and how much success it had brought him in his past life. And that was just a frontline sales leader of ours. And last but not least, just discussing that impact and ways to track before launch. So MEDDPICC's going to look really cute and a really great theory and a cool way to streamline all your stuff with a deal review, neat, shiny object. But really, what are those things that you're going to do to make sure you can actually track your impact and make sure you have those in place before you launch? So that could look something like integrating your deal review into your CRM because it's easier, or figuring out ways that you're going to look for this content in your call intelligence system if you have a gong or a chorus or something of that nature, right? But just look at those impacts and make sure that you have all of those ways to track. And we bring that up specifically because, of course, as sales enablement professionals, we're always trying to track our ROI, but this is so critically important because you'll see that MEDDPICC kind of integrates and goes everywhere. So that is much harder to track impact than it is for like a single product or something like that. So those are all the things we learned. Nikki's going to now walk us through a quick sample rollout.
Okay, and also just to put your mind at ease, because I know sometimes the text can be a little small, we will share the deck afterwards as well, so that if you want to review any of these and get, get the up close and personal. I'm mainly saying that because I know the text on this one is small. Okay, so sample rollout. The way that I think about MEDDPICC rollout is, what are the things that you need to do pre-rollout? What are the things you need to do during the active rollout? And then how are you going to follow up? So for pre-rollout, I think that it's very important to take the time to align with stakeholders. So I'll share, personal example on this. At NetSuite, we did take the time to align with different stakeholders as part of our account management rollout. So we were able to have a much longer runway. We were able to gather insight from different teams, in particular about the CRM integration. And so that was a much smoother process. Whereas on the direct side, because it was a request from them based on the results on the account management side, the timeline was much shorter. They wanted it rolled out immediately so that they could see the impact right away without fully thinking through what it would actually take to get to the same level. And that ended up coming later to bite us in the butt. So, so definitely, if as much as in your power to ensure that you are driving your stakeholders to spend the time on aligning on expectations, what they expect this to look like, the initiative drivers, why are they actually adopting it? And then related to that, what are the actual metrics? So that before you actually go into the project, you know how you're going to measure it, and then you can follow up with that actual impact. Next, share external resources for buy-in. This is especially important in a rollout, for example, like where I am now at NetSuite, because there was such little pre-existing knowledge around MEDDPICC. We have a very tenured team who a lot of them have just worked at NetSuite for their entire sales careers, and they have no exposure to MEDDPICC whatsoever. So they don't really see why they need to change things, even though they do want to see improved forecasting. They do want to see increased average selling prices. They do want to see those things, but they don't understand the connection between how MEDDPICC is going to get them there. So sharing those external resources for me has been huge, because as we share customer stories with our customers about why they should listen to us, it's the exact same thing with MEDDPICC. So it means a lot more hearing a podcast from a CRO at another organization about how MEDDPICC helped him scale his organization than it does me just saying like, oh, MEDDPICC is great and your boss told you need to do this. So that has been really big. I will also say on the sharing external resources, a big thing is making sure if you have a large enablement function that they are MEDDPICC champions as well. So that's something I'm driving currently with our enablement team. We actually have a MEDDPICC book club with just our sales enablement advisors where we're reading through. I think I have the book with me right now. It's definitely, oh, here it is. Like, it's always within arm's reach. So we literally are doing that because our sales enablement advisors are the champions to the managers, who are then the champions to their reps. So you have to make sure that those people know what they're talking about. And then review CRM integration. Whenever possible, be as proactive as you can. Start that conversation early, especially if you're in a big organization. We have been in the midst of our MEDDPICC rollout for 4 months on the direct side, and we still don't have CRM integration, because there's so many different stakeholders fighting over what that should look like, where it should go, etc. It took us 6 months on the account management side. Luckily, we had that runway, so we were able to have it available by the time we launched. But again, the more runway you can give for yourself, the better. For the actual launch, typically, anytime you're just information dumping, you want to keep it asynchronous. So don't be afraid to start with a big info dump at the beginning, because MEDDPICC is easy to understand. It's difficult to execute. The devil is in the details when it comes to MEDDPICC. So again, don't be afraid to do a big overview at the beginning and then dig into it later. Provide updated collateral and resources whenever possible. Have those ready to go at launch. So if it's a resource that they're using on a daily basis, then by the time you launch MEDDPICC, you need to make sure it's already in your decks, your call scripts, your whatever they're using on their meetings actively. Always train managers before you train reps. Of course, that's pretty basic, but it's especially important if you want your managers to be champions for you. And then support team training. So this is a big one that, again, we're facing at NetSuite is how do we involve the solutions consultants? They did not want anything to do with MEDDPICC initially, and now they're realizing that that was a big miss on their part. So make sure that you're prepared for that and able to provide that advice to your stakeholders. That is something that they definitely need to consider. How everyone else, we have a really big support team. We have solutions consultants, we have solutions principals, we have competitive intelligence team, value management teams, RFP teams. We have all kinds of teams that need to be looped into what this whole MEDDPICC thing is. And then finally, again, the biggest piece with MEDDPICC is the follow-up. It is easy to understand. It is really hard to master. So definitely make sure that you have a plan for that. That will include one-on-one MEDDPICC coaching. Your managers might need you to hold their hand the first few when this is a new concept for them. So again, going back to the point about enablement needs to be MEDDPICC experts. Team MEDDPICC deal reviews are really amazing because sometimes a rep isn't great at looking at their own opportunities and facing reality, but they're pretty good at pointing it out for other people on their team. So this can be a really good exercise to practice looking for those deal risks based on the MEDDPICC framework. Additional focused MEDDPICC training content. So a few areas that I've found are very difficult for people to grasp are metrics. Again, implicating pain is one of those that is always a challenge, but now you have a new way to leverage that topic. So those are two of the big ones that I get asked a lot about. Make sure you're integrating MEDDPICC into existing enablement programs. So tying into the question in the chat, this has been a big challenge for us as well, is the launch was relatively straightforward, but because we're using MEDDPICC only on upmarket sales teams, we don't use it on our emerging sales teams. They're still on a BANT qualification framework. We are using it on our account management side, but that started before the direct side. So think about how you're going to integrate that into onboarding to get new joiners to the team up to speed on where your team is at. So that is the sample rollout, and then just a few suggested resources that you may want to provide to your team include, as I mentioned, the external MEDDPICC resource list, asynchronous learning for overview, training decks that are audience specific, so manager, rep, support team. The MEDDPICC deal review guide. This is really important for managers to be able to have a MEDDPICC coaching session with the reps. A lot of times they don't know the questions to ask or what that should actually look like. That's a really big change for them away from their current deal strategy sessions. So giving them a guide can be very helpful, and or building that directly into your CRM. Team MEDDPICC deal review deck template. Of course, you want to have a launch survey, updated call scripts, email templates, etc., meeting decks, any kind of collateral. And this is a big one that Lindsay reminded me of, is an example of what great looks like. Okay, that was a lot, but we promised that we would have time for Q&A. We were debating, we had 55 registrants for the session. I kind of had a feeling there wouldn't be 55 people on here. A lot of people are probably counting on the recording. So because we have a small group, we'll keep it to open question and answers. So who has questions for Lindsay or I, or anybody in the group? A lot of you have experience as well, so.
I'll jump in. We've already kind of announced it, so we've done the kickoff there, but at the actual kickoff coming up in about a month, we're planning on doing some breakout sessions. Any exercises that you can recommend for that environment?
Yeah, good question. So I think one thing that worked really well, and you'll want to just lean on your sales leaders to help you understand if you have prior folks who have medic experience. But what was really helpful for us was doing a whiteboarding exercise to walk through the different steps of medic. So early in the session, I went through and said, hey, here's what the M stands for. Here's a question you could answer. Here's what the E stands for. Here's a question you could answer, things like that. What we did for our main workshop, because we had a fair amount of folks who could just think of really common things or common questions or common tracks, we had them tell us, well, what do you think is a metric that commonly comes up from your opportunity? Or who is your common economic buyer? And had them generate those questions versus us dictating what that looked like. And that was really helpful because it ended up being seller driven, and it helped gain confidence that they actually knew what they were doing. And they were already gathering so many of these things they needed for that qualification framework. They just didn't have a formal process for it yet. So I would definitely recommend doing that, an interactive whiteboard session. We did that live if it was in person, or we did that via an iPad if it was virtual.
Yeah, similarly, that was a big thing for us as well, was so one exercise that we did in our breakout rooms was to have the list of medic, come up with in small groups, come up with as many medic questions as you can. But an extra element that I would add to that is having them circle which ones are new to your process. Because to Lindsay's point, it helped them recognize that 80% of this is stuff that they should already be asking about, but highlighting what are those extra pieces that you have a new level of awareness for that you're now going to be more proactive about asking.
I'm curious if you all created an e-learning style program for them to go back to reference. Obviously, when you're sharing things live and trying to get people to kind of implement, you still have people who want to go back and reference. You might be like, what's the D stand for?
Good question. My sellers are very anti e-learn, very anti e-learn. So what we did instead is we built out a couple of things. One, a job aid. So it just had a quick reference guide of, hey, what is the acronym? What are some sample questions? And a link to what great looks like if they wanted to be able to see it. We also had a micro learning video for each of our different pieces of our acronyms, so that if they truly did want to watch, it would be about 3 minutes and kind of explain, hey, this is what the metrics look like. Here's the typical questions you would ask at the beginning of the op versus the typical questions you would ask to validate at the end of the op. And we linked that on the same job aid. So our job aid became the single source of truth that lives in HighSpot. So that was a lot more successful for us, but we know that from historic context of our sellers being pretty detracting towards an e-learn.
I would say for us, we did do an e-learning just for the asynchronous portion, just to get everybody an overview. But in reality, as much as we like to think that they'll go back and reference it, they don't at all, ever. So the two most used resources that I would say I get requested for and share is question lists for and I think this is important to differentiate as well, is like questions you as a sales rep ask your rep to uncover this information, and then questions you as a sales manager or a peer ask to test this information. So both of those lists of questions I think have been really key to the reinforcement. I will also say, pro tip, this is just recent and it's top of mind, so even though you didn't ask, I'm going to tell you, but I had so much trouble getting reps to just fill out medic information. Like I think it's probably like a pretty obvious activity is like pull up a deal that's in your pipeline and MEDDPICC it, right? And like it's not as easy as it sounds. Surprise, surprise. And what I found that really removed a big barrier was to tell them to do metrics at the end. Because as soon as they go in and they look at MEDDPICC and they see the M as the very first thing, which is also the hardest and most complex thing to even wrap your brain around, much less actually ask your prospect for, they were just like, no, I'm not like, this is too time consuming. This is too hard. I'm not doing it. Once I moved metrics to the end and said, let's just start with the economic buyer, they were like, oh, okay, we got this. And that really removed a lot of barriers. So pro tip recently discovered.
That also reminds me of a very similar thing. And Nikki, if you don't mind, I'll share my screen really quick. But something that I think is really helpful. So to Nikki's point, like simplification is so important. Otherwise, folks, especially who haven't used MEDDPICC before, go into like full panic mode that I'm never going to do this again. So the way that we actually simplified for our teams and some of the ways that we put together our reinforcement materials is actually putting in place like, hey, even though you have your MEDDPICC, you've got all these metrics, they really just tie to these three things, which is pain, process, and people. And at the end of the day, that's all you're trying to do, right? Is figure out the right people to give you the right problem that's compelling enough to sell your solution and figure out the process for it. So this has been the number one most helpful thing. And most of our sellers have gone back to, and most of our leaders are re-asking us for, is what does this look like? And so then when we did this workshop, we actually started with pain, walked through metrics and identify, then process and walked through criteria, our decision criteria process and implementation, then our people. But whatever you need to do to simplify it, like this, that will work really well because your sellers want to be able to look at something in like 2 seconds or less before they get on the call. Because I guarantee you they're panicking at 2:59 when they have a 3 o'clock user call.
At my
Or maybe that's just mine.
P.S. I loved that graph actually with those lines were amazing. At my previous company, one of the kind of neat things they did to keep the ball rolling on the MEDDPICC rollout was deal wins, was having them record a deal win that hit those points, right? Where they would look at a series of questions that more or less didn't say, tell us about the metrics, but paraphrase it in a way that made sense for them to answer it. And featuring those deal wins helped others to say, oh, I see how this is being used and how they saw success in it. So just want to throw that in there.
Yeah, really good call out. Those deal wins are so important and thinking about how to frame them for sure. What other questions are out there? We've got a couple minutes still.
I'll ask another one. Sorry, Shannon, you want to go? All right, I'm already talking. You mentioned Gong and conversation intelligence. Some of these terms are very generic. Any recommendations as far as search terms that you put in for the trackers? I
wish we had Gong. So we got very far down the line with them and then we had the kibosh put on us. But when we were looking at this and for metrics, we were, as Nikki said, like we need to figure out what all those metrics are for launch. And for us, what we cared the most about was that implementation, and that actually speaks more to the fact that like our sellers are really bad at selling all of the products and then not helping the user activate on all of their products. So we want to focus on implementation. So we actually had a couple of bespoke words that were Stripe specific for those Q&A questions because implementation and like needing to know what specific API connector you need, what specific payment methods was the user going to use, those types of questions. Those are very easy to pull out. They're a little bit more specific. So I would encourage you to figure out what customization you can do for MEDDPICC that's going to help your business specifically, because there's definitely something there. And then try to use Gong or Chorus or whatever your conversation intelligence is to find those versus trying to find the generic like metrics, right? What do you care about most, right? Everybody asks that. So Nikki, what are your thoughts? I don't remember if you have a CI tool.
Don't get me started. are owned by Oracle. I don't know if I mentioned, which is a great thing and a terrible thing. Oracle has the strictest like IT and legal regulations of any company that I've ever worked for. We are not even allowed to record our Zoom calls internally, much less have a recording software. The only types of calls we can record are demos, and that is for the express purpose of sharing with prospects, not for training. So again, very strict. I did use Chorus at my first company that we did the rollout. My question would be in terms of trackers is like thinking about the reason why you want to use the trackers. Like, is it for coaching? Is it for, you know, compliance? Like, what is the reason? I think that can determine it. One way that we use trackers was because we were such an early stage company. We were trying to gather kind of like customer case stories and examples. It was really hard for us to get a what does great look like, especially in terms of things like metrics. So we would try to be as pointed as possible about specifics. So for example, would be things like impact, investment, like strategy or strategic, like those kind of things related to that. So we could find those examples to share with other people. It wasn't necessarily about trying to like coach them on that necessarily.
And I know we're right at time. There was a question that came through in the chat. And then Shannon, I know you had a question as well. Just asking if we have experience running a pilot with a smaller team for rolling it out to a greater team. Feel free to reach out to me. I have, but for a broader methodology rollout versus MEDDPICC specific. So again, we talked about the art and the science, the methodology at Tableau was both. So feel free to reach out to me. Nikki, do you have experience with pilots? Did you run a pilot for either of yours?
Yeah, so we did do pilots, but I will say that I think there was not as much enablement involvement in the pilots as there should have been. And we paid the price in that it's been very hard to get those pilot teams to change the thinking about MEDDPICC. They developed some of their own kind of styles of things. And so it's been kind of a hard habit to break. So I would say, yes, we did. It was useful for a proof of concept, but challenging from a scaling. And happy to elaborate more one-on-one if you have more specific questions. But I think that's where we can end it, is that Lindsay and I know that I'll speak for her because I feel like I know that this is what she'll say, which is please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. Or I saw, you know, like your tracker question, Todd has been in the enablement squad. I'm sure you've seen that thread, but there are so many of us who are going through this together. So don't hesitate to reach out. Definitely jump on the webinars, but also, you know, don't hesitate to reach out and ask for a one-on-one conversation. This is how Lindsay and I even started comparing our experiences. So, you know, don't feel like you're bothering anybody by doing that.
Cool. +1 on that. All right, y'all. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the extra time. We appreciate it. Have a good day or have a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah, any more questions for us, Shannon? I think not. Okay, you want to stop the recording?
Yeah.